try the starting the timer thing so I actually pay attention to the time. Okay, so we're going to close the day talking about behavior evaluations. Where is the... Don't take this from her time, okay? Okay, so we're going to talk about behavior evaluations. And I'm going to skip over that because you know who I am now. In terms of the activities that my team does, we do a lot of work on behavior evaluations. We evaluate all our cruelty case animals, and often if we're helping a shelter with a cruelty case, we'll come in and evaluate their animals as well. We also do evaluations for other agencies on their cruelty case animals when we're requested to come in. Why should we evaluate? What is the purpose of doing a behavior evaluation? Well, this video illustrates it best, I think. I forgot to unmute my computer. There's no sound on this anyway, really, but I just remembered.
AmeriQuest Mortgage, proud sponsor of the
We do behavior evaluations because we don't want to judge animals on anything other than their behavior. We want to give them the opportunity to represent their behavior profiles to us. So in terms of why we do evaluations, well, certainly we want to identify dogs that could be a danger, either to be held in the shelter or to adopt out to the community. We want to assess quality of life as well. Are these dogs suffering so severely that it's unfair to keep them in the shelter situation? And are there other options that we have for these animals? We need to develop an understanding of this animal. What is it like? What's its personality? What are its behavioral needs while it's in the shelter? And then we can identify if they have any specific behavioral concerns that hopefully we can address while they're under our care. And then finally, of course, we want to make the best adoption matches as we can. So the more we know about the animals, the better off we are in terms of doing that. So those are the objectives of doing a behavior evaluation. I'm going to talk about behavior evaluations in general as opposed to specific tests. And in general, we're talking about typically a standardized series of simulations. And these simulations are designed to mimic the everyday experiences and the life of a companion animal. That's what we're expecting these animals to experience once they're adopted, so that's what we want to mimic in these evaluations. And some of them that are published are designed to be provocative because their goal is really to reveal specifically whether or not these dogs are going to be, or these animals are going to be aggressive. And some are designed to be more comprehensive, to get a more comprehensive picture of the animal's personality. And then as well, some are very specific. So typically most of your standard shelter behavior evaluations are going to have components that involve assessing the sociability of the dog. How interested is this dog in interacting with people? Typically, the evaluation is going to be held in a novel environment, so you're able to assess how that animal is dealing with that kind of novelty. Often there will be handling subtests, pleasant handling, unpleasant handling, again, the kinds of things that an animal would be exposed to in a normal pet situation. Playfulness. A lot of the tests will have some components of how does this animal deal with object play? Do they recognize toys? Do they get really aroused? And then oftentimes there's also interactive play. So the person, the evaluator elicits play and looks to see how the dog's going to respond to that. Most tests will involve components of resource guarding. Give the dog a bowl of food, and then somehow interfere with the animal. And again, the tests vary a lot in how much interference they do, how standardized that is. But the idea is to try and mimic what an owner might do in the home. And you may be looking just at food, or you may be looking at food and some kind of chewy, like rawhide or a pig's ear. And many of the tests also include the use of a toddler doll. I always joke that it would be great if I had someone on my staff that would volunteer their child so that we could get a for sure valid test, but they won't do that. So we use a doll with the idea that it's going to give us possibly some information about how the dog might react to a child's approach. And then finally, some kind of dog sociability test, some type of assessment of how they're going to interact or react to another dog. And some of the tests are going to have additional fear tests that are specifically designed to measure the dog's reactivity to certain stimuli, and then possibly also recovery time. So for instance, some of the tests that are out there will, again, give the dog a bowl of food and then do something horrifying like open an umbrella, and then look to see not only the dog's reaction to the umbrella opening, but then also how much time it takes the dog to resume eating, if it does at all. And some of the tests will include components of assessing the dog's previous history of training. So how does the dog respond to many of the very common cues that people use, like sit and down and come and stay, and then if they don't appear to have that history of training, what's their trainability assessment? So how quickly do they respond to what the evaluator is trying to teach them? And then some tests will involve some kind of very, very simple problem solving, like putting a treat underneath a cup and seeing if the dog recognizes to knock it over. So what I'm going to do is again, introduce just a typical behavior evaluation. This is not one that's necessarily representative of a published version. It's actually the evaluation that we found to be quite practical and useful in our emergency shelter situations. So it's been shortened a little bit. It's actually not moving at all. There it goes. Yay. So we typically give the dog a full... This is running on my computer, so I can't even blame the IT people. After they have the opportunity to become more comfortable in the environment, then we solicit interaction with the dog. And then we do what should be, what we expect to be perceived as pleasant by the dog. Of course, don't all perceive it that way, but it's meant to be. It's meant to feel good. And then we also do something that's meant to not feel good, to see how the dog might react if he had a burr pulled out of his hair or had a visit with the veterinarian for vaccines. We use some kind of soft, fleecy kind of tug toy.
Not my arm. Going more for my arm. There you go. Tugs with me. If I drop it.
And whether or not they engage in it, we also drop it and then see if they'll play with it on their own, and then see if they will guard it when we try to pick it up. Okay. This is the interactive play without a toy. It's kind of like a tag or a chase game. This is often quite horrifying to dogs that aren't used to it. This is every dog's favorite part, usually. We're quite standardized. We stroke the back, we touch by the collar, we touch their face, and then we push on the face. So we do the same procedure with every dog. We do the same thing with the pig's ear. And I had to put in one just for entertainment's sake. We had a defective Assessa hand, it broke. Here's our toddler doll test. We've actually discovered much more realistic dolls that we use now. Again, we were pretty standardized. We approach, we make a sudden movement, and then we have the doll kind of loom over the dog while it's trapped. And then we typically walk the doll away.
You are a very bad dog. Go on, get out of here.
And then we scold the dog and make friends afterwards. So that's kind of the standard evaluation whoops, what happened? We went too far. With some element of dog-dog testing at the end. We leave the dog introduction till the very end of the test. And I say some degree of because we're dealing with, again, as I mentioned, cruelty case animals. So we have dogs from puppy mills and hoarding cases. We tend to not do as intensive dog-dog testing with those as we do with the dogs that we have from our dog fighting cases. So with the dog fighting cases, I'm going to talk more about this when I talk about the dangerous dog evaluations in a couple days. But typically what we're going to do is introduce the dogs through a barrier first. And it's actually the dog on the left that is the test dog. The dog on the right is the helper dog. And often we don't have great choices of helper dogs. This is a lovely dog, but he's absolutely enormous and wants to hump everything. So, but we literally had a choice of two when we burned the first one out, and that was it. We always do same-sex helper dog, and if we want more information, we may do an opposite sex. But if we're going to do any dog-dog testing, it's going to be same-sex dog because they're more likely, if they're going to show aggression, they're going to go show aggression to a same-sex. And some of the tests that are out there don't specify the sex of the helper dog, but I think that's really critical. We have at least one good study with a very significant sample size that indicated that they're going to be more likely to be aggressive to same-sex dogs than opposite sex. So that's the procedure that we go through. We do that barrier first, then we'll kind of hold them at a distance and see their reaction, and then usually do a dog introduction. Depending on what we see, we may or may not muzzle the test dog as part of that, at least in the beginning. But we do try to get a very thorough introduction with dogs, particularly in our fighting cases. So what makes a good behavior evaluation? We have some very specific scientific parameters that tell us what constitutes a good evaluation. And having said that, I'll say there's very, very, very little research that exists to actually give us information about these tests, but it's starting to happen now. There are more and more publications coming out now. In terms of reliability, the test should be reliable. It should be that if I test the dog or you test the dog ends up basically with the same evaluation and the same interpretation. Also, if I test the dog on Monday or I test the dog on Friday, depending on how tired I am at the end of the week, the dog should still end up with the same evaluation and the same score, regardless of the timing of that testing in terms of the tester. And then also because we assume, we want to be tapping into the dog's consistent, pervasive personality traits as opposed to just variations in behavior that may be very context specific, we would expect that if we did test the dog multiple times, that they would essentially perform the same way on the test each time, assuming that there's some variation due to learning, but for the most part, we are talking about trying to get at consistent personality traits. So those are the aspects of reliability. Then there's validity, and there are actually more validity measures, but in terms of the ones that make most sense and are most relevant to behavior evaluations, we're talking about content validity and predictive validity. Yeah, this is our doll that we call the burn victim. She looks so horrible. I think she's actually been murdered since this photo. But content validity refers to whether or not the simulation is actually getting at what you want to test. So, for instance, is there any correlation between how the dog reacts to a toddler doll and how he reacts to a child? And again, we have almost no research at all to guide us on whether or not this particular subtest has any content validity. The same with the use of the fake hand, the assessa hand. We have very little information to go on as to whether it actually is valid. Predictive validity is certainly the most critical aspect, I would say, from our perspective, because one of the main purposes in doing the evaluation, of course, is to try and predict how that dog is going to behave once it's adopted. So, so predictive validity refers to that correlation. Now, when it comes to validation studies, predictive validation studies, there's really two models that can be followed. And again, like I said, the research is so much in its infancy, we haven't got a pile of research studies anyway, but there are really two types. There's the follow-up after adoption format, meaning that you evaluate the dogs that are suitable for adoption or put up for adoption. If they get adopted, then you follow up with them in the home and find out how they did, and look to see whether there was any correlation between how they did on the evaluation and how they're doing in the home. A couple of limitations to that. Certainly you're going to have a loss of subjects, because anytime you do a follow-up study, you lose subjects because people disappear. And you have a very biased population, because the dogs that did not do well in the evaluation don't end up on the adoption floor, don't get adopted, so you have no information on whether you accurately identified those dogs. And then most of these studies that do exist are going to rely on owner reports. They end up surveying the owners, asking them questions about their behavior, and then trying to interpret how that relates to what they looked at in the evaluation. There's been one or two studies now that have done a better job of that, where they've actually either gone to the home or had the owners bring the dogs back to the shelter and re-evaluate them, do the whole evaluation again after adoption. So that's a much more accurate procedure. The second type of format that works for testing validation is to actually evaluate owned dogs. So rather than validating it on the shelter population, you validate it on owned dogs, where the owners are very familiar with the dog's history of behavior. They can very accurately describe their dog's personality, usually using, again, a validated procedure like the CBARC questionnaire, and then you put the dogs through the evaluation, and does the evaluation match what the owners have said about the dogs? And if it does, then you can perceive it as a validated procedure that you could use on shelter dogs as well. Again, almost none of that has been done yet. There's one or two studies that have looked at certain aspects of tests based on that procedure. The one argument there is that you can say, well, the dogs aren't stressed to the same degree as dogs that are in shelters, but at least one of the studies looked at dogs in a boarding kennel, so it was a similar kind of situation. Okay, oh my, yeah, my phone is not, yeah, okay, 10 minutes. Actually, 10.5. I want every second. The last thing to consider about an evaluation is the practicality. How much time does it take? What kind of resources does it require in terms of space, in terms of staff, and how does it meet that specific shelter's needs? We have 3 standardized evaluations that are in common use in the US, but I want to emphasize there's absolutely no gold standard. There are many things that a shelter would want to consider when deciding what type of evaluation to use and whether or not they need to modify it for their specific purposes. But Assess-a-Pet is one that has been around for a very long time. Sue Sternberg's, Dr. Amy Marder's matchup has some research to back it up now, and then ASPCA has Dr. Emily Weiss's SAFER test, which is a very practical test for shelters that have limited resources because it's very quick. Another consideration that should come into play is the scoring system. And there's really, again, 2 types of scoring systems that these tests tend to use. This is from the matchup procedure, and it's very much focused on frequencies of behaviors. So it'll have very specific behaviors, like the dog licked the person, the dog had their tail tucked, the dog was trembling, and so it's very, very objective. And the other version is, this is from the SAFER, where it's more of a description of behavioral sequences. And so, it's much more descriptive. Dog stands still and accepts the touch. His eyes are averted and his tail is in a neutral position with relaxed body posture. Dog's mouth is likely closed for at least a portion of the assessment. Great. Problem is, what if the dog doesn't do any of the things that are on the list? So sometimes it can be more challenging for the recorder because they're like, well, it's partly this one and partly this one, and then what do we do? However, it's much easier than the previous one for interpretation in terms of what does it actually mean? How do we interpret this as opposed to looking at a sequence of, okay, the dog had his tail tucked and his ears were back, but his tail was wagging or sorry, you can't have a tucked, well, you can, but anyway. So you see what I mean, that it can be challenging. And there's no, again, gold standard. This is the scoring system that we've developed, so it is more of the behavioral sequence approach. This is an example from the food guarding test, where again we have the reactions to each specific interference that we do. So touching the dog's body, touching its neck, touching its face, and then pushing against its face. And we aid in the interpretation by having our little symbols here that these are all acceptable responses. These are concerning, they're a red flag. These are behaviors of concern, and then there's some that often fall into the not valid. So if the dog doesn't eat or is too afraid in general, then we're able to do that. Evaluator training, also incredibly important. In all of the tests that you're going to use, because you are putting the tester in direct contact with a dog that presumably you know very little about. And so it's good to have, you need to have people who are objective, who are good observers of dog behavior, that are good at interpreting dog behavior, and are good defensive handlers. So I'm going to show you this very disturbing video. Sorry for the people who saw it yesterday and have to see it again. But Dr. Weiss shared this with me, why we do the things we do, and again, okay, that's bad. What's happening? My computer locked up? It never locks up. Can we just play it in Windows Media, if we have to? I'm going to run out of time. Restart the computer? Oh, jeez. Okay, well, I guess we won't see. I'm sorry? Oh, yay, okay. Yay, thank you, thank you, thank you. So just to point out some things that you're seeing here, if she were handling this dog defensively, her left hand would not be resting loosely on her leg. She had no ability to defend herself if that dog had decided to do something. She's in a very, very small space. Now you're starting to see that the dog's definitely not comfortable. She's got the dog on a slip lead. There's no collar on the dog, so she has no ability to grip that dog if she needs to. She now has her face disturbingly close to that dog. Which again, I mean, if the dog were showing relaxed body language, I might be okay doing that, but this dog is not. And now she is bending over the dog and not paying that close of attention to the dog, really. And she had no way to protect herself. So very, very important. This is, I mean, people who evaluate dogs put themselves in significant risk. So, okay, 5 minutes. Okay, I was going to talk about, puppies. We have 5 minutes to talk about puppies. Puppies often get neglected because all of these evaluations that are published tend to say, this is appropriate for dogs over 5 months of age. And we too have the situation where it's good to get information on puppies. Now, again, the research out there is limited, but the research that does exist indicate that puppy tests have very questionable predictive validity. If you do follow up on the puppies after they're adopted, there's often no correlation whatsoever with how they did on the evaluation. It makes sense because these animals are still developing, they're very malleable. However, there's some evidence as well to indicate that at least the evaluation is giving you information on what the puppy is like right now, and that's what the adopter needs to know. So I still think it's valuable to do puppy tests, but we take them with even more of a grain of salt than we do with the adults. So in the few minutes we have left, I'll show you the video a video of the puppy evaluation that we use in our emergency shelters. Some of it's very similar to what you saw with the adults. It's based somewhat on the Volhard and Fisher, I think, puppy aptitude test. So what you saw in the beginning was just, will they come to the person who's soliciting attention? Will they follow the person? Now it's a toy test. Again, we tend to use Tug Toys. This was an incredible opportunity that we had a number of years ago with a case called the Missouri 500, where it was a dogfighting case, and they seized 500 dogs from multiple sites, and then they had almost 200 puppies born during the protective custody stage. So we were able to evaluate the puppies repeatedly during that period of time. We do a restraint test with the puppies. And it's long, it's 3 minutes. We won't subject you to the whole 3 minutes on the video. But we arrived at 3 minutes because it seemed long enough to piss the puppy off. If they're going to get pissed off, they'll get pissed off within 3 minutes. So this is the piss the puppy off test. But we combine handling with this test, so we're touching them at the same time, messing with them. But also it's very soothing touch for the most part. And depending on the age of the puppy, you might choose to have them sit up kind of in your lap or have them totally recumbent. This is also where you get an indication of how mouthy the puppies are and how hard they will mouth. Maybe I did subject you to a full 3 minutes.
Body still relaxed. Eyes and face still soft.
You can hear Kristen in the background kind of giving a running commentary on what the puppy's doing. That's because these repeated evaluations comprised her master's thesis, which I probably don't have time to tell you about, but we videotape. Again, these animals are cruelty case victims, so we're videotaping every single evaluation we do with them, and they can be subpoenaed by the court.
More licking as Tester touches muzzle, licking Tester's hand. Licking the Tester's face as Tester touches his paws. Licking the Tester's hand some more. Here's still back. It's nice but soft, body still relaxed.
And as you can imagine, some of the puppies fall asleep during this procedure. Some of them are so terrified that they are stiff and frozen in position the whole time.
Gently nibbles on Tester's fingers.
Doesn't that count? Almost done.
Time.
This is going to look very similar to the adult test, except that we don't use the assess a hand.
To petting. Continues to eat. A little bit of resistance. When Tester pushes head out of bowl, more resistance. Follows the bowl when it's pulled away. Takes the figure. Lots of wagging.
I guess I figured you didn't need to see that, all that. So then we do a couple of different puppy tests.
Bouncy movements, ears back, tail wags.
If they have a litter mate, we will test them with their litter mate.
Handler for a second.
If we're doing repeated testing, we test them with a different litter mate each time. These two were no longer housed together,
The test puppy.
so they didn't routinely see each other and have a chance to interact. The evaluator remains on the floor so that the puppies, A, can interact with her if they choose to, and B, can also use her as a refuge if they need to. Then we try to find a litter mate, or an unfamiliar puppy that's about the same age.
Yeah, so that was the test puppy. Yeah, test puppy snarling, jumping on
Sex,
the this puppy's back.
when it comes to the puppies, it doesn't matter.
Biting.
And then, again, I have to add something to make it interesting. With this particular procedure, we also tried a fake puppy. Again, because this was Kristen's master's thesis, and we wanted to know if that was a useful tool. And in particular, because these were puppies from a fighting case, we wanted to know if there was anything that would emerge during these evaluations that we could use as a predictor of future aggression towards other dogs.
Bites and shakes. Bites, holds, and shakes the fake dog's neck.
And in particular, this is the kind of thing where we're looking at, we're measuring the frequency of bites and the frequency of bites and holds and bite holds and shakes on both litter mates, on playmates, and on the fake puppy. And so to close, I will just skip over these next couple videos and show you the results, which was the fake puppy was not a valid tool. It was treated like a toy. So they showed a lot of biting, holding, and shaking to the fake puppy. And they also showed a lot of play biting to real puppies, but they did not do the holding and shaking to any degree. So it was interesting. However, we weren't able to find anything that would reliably predict aggression in these puppies later on. But again, it provides you a decent profile of what the puppy is like at that moment in time for adoption. So I am out of time. Again, poor cats got left out. I'm sorry. I'll have to find a way to get them in somewhere. But thank you for your attention.